The frost on the plexiglass had begun to crystallize into delicate patterns, each breath from Lieutenant David Thompson adding another layer to the ice forming inside the waist gun position of the B-17 bomber. It was December 9, 1944, and his crew was returning from a bombing run over Mannheim when everything changed. Through the darkness at 23,000 feet, something appeared on their port side that would haunt Thompson for the rest of his life. At first, he thought it was a reflection, perhaps the moonlight playing tricks on his exhausted eyes after 7 hours in the air. But then the objects multiplied. Glowing orbs, brilliantly orange and pulsating with an internal light that seemed almost alive, began to pace their bomber with impossible precision. They moved with an intelligence that defied everything Thompson knew about physics and aerial combat. These weren't falling flares, they weren't anti-aircraft tracers, and they certainly weren't any aircraft in the German Luftwaffe inventory. The pilot, Captain William Roberts, saw them too. So did the navigator, the bombardier, and every man who could find a window in that flying fortress. The objects maintained perfect formation with their aircraft, matching every turn, every altitude change, every evasive maneuver that Roberts attempted in growing desperation. They didn't attack, didn't communicate, didn't deviate. They simply observed, glowing orbs of unknown origin, escorting a terrified bomber crew through hostile airspace. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the European theater and in the Pacific, combat aircrews were reporting identical encounters with what they began calling Foo Fighters, borrowing the term from a popular comic strip of the era. These were experienced military aviators, men who had survived dozens of combat missions, who could identify enemy aircraft in a fraction of a second, who understood the difference between flak bursts and engine fires and atmospheric phenomena. Their testimonies were detailed, consistent, and deeply unsettling to military intelligence officers who couldn't explain what was happening in their own airspace. In the coming episodes, we'll examine 6 specific encounters that military investigators could never dismiss and never solve. We'll meet the pilots who saw these objects up close, hear their detailed accounts, and explore why the phenomenon seemed to vanish as mysteriously as it appeared when the war ended. What were these glowing visitors that haunted the bomber streams over Germany and Japan? Why did they appear only during humanity's darkest conflict? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why have they never returned? The night sky over Germany in 1943 belonged to machines and the men who flew them. 20,000 feet above the earth, inside the vibrating aluminum shell of a B-17 flying fortress, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on oxygen masks. The smell of oil, metal, and fear filled the confined space. These were the conditions in which young men, barely out of their teens, witnessed something that would haunt military intelligence files for decades to come. Flight Lieutenant Edward Schlueter first saw them on November 23, 1944, over the Rhine Valley. Small metallic spheres, glowing with an orange light, pacing his aircraft at precisely the same speed. They maintained formation with his bomber, matching every turn, every altitude change, with mechanical precision. When he reported it to his commanding officer upon landing, exhausted and rattled, he expected dismissal, perhaps even psychiatric evaluation. Instead, he found that 17 other crews had reported identical encounters that same night. The Allied High Command faced a terrifying possibility. The Germans had developed some new weapon, something beyond the V-1 rockets already terrorizing London, something that could track and pace Allied bombers with impunity. Every major power in the war had poured desperate resources into advanced weapons research. The Germans had their rocket scientists at Peenemünde. The Americans had their own shadowy projects in the New Mexico desert. The race for technological supremacy had reached a fever pitch, and paranoia infected every level of military command. But here was the bizarre twist that would only emerge years later, when classified documents from both sides began surfacing. The Germans were seeing them too. Luftwaffe pilots, flying night intercept missions against Allied bombing raids, reported the exact same phenomenon. Glowing spheres, sometimes silver, sometimes orange or red, that followed their fighters through defensive maneuvers, through clouds, through everything. They called them Kraut fireballs at first, Then Foo Fighters, a name borrowed from the American comic strip Smokey Stover, where the character often said where there's foo, there's fire. Nay. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Augsburger, Chief of Intelligence for the 8th Air Force, created a special investigation unit in December of 1944. This was not some fringe operation staffed by eccentric believers. This was mainstream military intelligence, tasked with determining whether these objects represented a genuine threat to Allied air superiority. The investigation was classified at the highest levels, and for good reason. The last thing the military wanted was widespread panic among bomber crews, already suffering casualty rates that approached 50% on some missions. The crews themselves existed in a state of sustained psychological trauma. They flew mission after mission into walls of anti-aircraft fire, watched friends incinerated in mid-air, saw bombers break apart, and spiral down with 10 men trapped inside. The life expectancy of a ball turret gunner was measured in weeks. These men were already seeing death every time they climbed into their aircraft. And now they were seeing something else. Something that defied every briefing, every technical manual, every understanding of what was possible in aerial combat. Technical Sergeant Donald Myers kept a detailed log of his encounters. On January 2, 1945, over Strasbourg, he documented 8 separate objects, each approximately 3 feet in diameter, that followed his B-24 Liberator for 14 minutes. He noted that they emitted no exhaust, made no sound that could be heard over the aircraft engines, and seemed to respond to the bomber's movements with impossible speed. When the pilot attempted evasive maneuvers, pulling the heavy bomber through sharp turns that pushed the crew against their restraints, the objects matched each movement instantly, as if connected by invisible wires. The official reports piled up. The 8th Air Force compiled them. The 9th Air Force compiled them. The Royal Air Force compiled them. And across enemy lines, German intelligence was doing exactly the same thing. Each side convinced that the other had achieved some breakthrough in aerial technology. Each side terrified that they were falling behind in a race that might determine the outcome of the war. What made the phenomenon particularly unsettling was its apparent intelligence. These were not random lights or atmospheric effects. The objects seemed to select specific aircraft, follow them, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, and then break off contact without warning. On several occasions, gunners opened fire on them, sending thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition into the glowing spheres. The bullets had no effect. The objects simply absorbed the fire, or perhaps ignored it, and continued their silent observation. By February of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the sightings intensified. Crews reported multiple objects now, sometimes dozens, creating formations around bomber streams. They appeared most frequently over strategically important targets, industrial centers, rail yards, weapons facilities. This pattern only reinforced the belief that they were some form of advanced reconnaissance technology. Intelligence officers theorized everything from remote-controlled drones to some new application of radar technology, perhaps designed to guide German fighters toward Allied formation. The psychological impact on crews became severe enough that flight surgeons began documenting it. Men who had flown 30 missions without breaking, who had survived direct hits and emergency landings, were coming back from encounters with these objects visibly shaken. Not because the objects had attacked them, but precisely because they had not. The silence, the observation, the sense of being tracked by something utterly unknown, proved more unnerving than flak or fighter attacks. At least those threats were understood. At least those threats followed known rules of physics and warfare. The Allies were not the only ones struggling with this. Declassified German documents from the period reveal identical concerns at Luftwaffe headquarters. Major Hans-Joachim Hermann, responsible for organizing Germany's night fighter defenses, filed multiple reports about anomalous objects interfering with his pilots' operations. He too suspected Allied secret weapons, perhaps some new form of electronic warfare designed to confuse German radar and targeting systems. He too ordered investigations, compiled reports, demanded answers from his superiors who had none to give. This created perhaps the strangest aspect of the entire phenomenon, a kind of proto-Cold War scenario where both sides believed the other possessed technology they could not understand or counter. Both sides were wrong. The objects were not German, and they were not Allied. They were something else entirely, something that appeared during humanity's most destructive conflict and watched with apparent interest as we tore ourselves apart. The official files, when they were finally declassified decades later, revealed the depth of institutional concern. The Robertson Panel, convened in January of 1953 to examine unennial phenomena, specifically referenced the wartime Foo Fighter reports as part of their investigation. The objects had been real enough to command the attention of intelligence services on both sides of the conflict, real enough to generate hundreds of pages of classified documentation, real enough that experienced pilots, men trained in aircraft recognition and aerial combat, insisted they had seen something that should not exist. What the crews could not have known, huddled in their freezing aircraft over burning cities, was that they were witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would extend far beyond the war. The Foo Fighters were merely the opening chapter of a phenomenon that would manifest across decades, across continents, in peacetime and war. Always just beyond reach, always defying explanation. But in those dark years from 1943 to 1945, all they knew was the cold, the fear, the constant presence of death, and now something new, something that watched from the darkness and followed them home. Lieutenant Henry Giblin had flown 63 combat missions over occupied Europe by November of 1944, and he prided himself on being the kind of pilot who didn't see things that weren't there. As a member of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, he had earned his reputation through precision and cold rationality, navigating the treacherous darkness above the Rhine Valley with the kind of steady nerves that separated the living from the dead. He had 7 confirmed kills to his name, each one documented, verified and cataloged in the official records. When other pilots returned from their missions with wild stories about strange lights dancing across the German skies, Giblin had dismissed them with barely concealed contempt. Combat fatigue, he told himself. Overactive imaginations pushed to their limits by the stress of night operations. Perhaps the reflection of searchlights off low clouds, or tracer fires seen from unusual angles. There was always a rational explanation, and Giblin made it his business to find it. The mission briefing on that cold November evening had been routine enough. His orders were straightforward: patrol the Rhine Valley corridor, intercept any enemy aircraft attempting to cross into Allied-controlled airspace, and return to base before dawn. His aircraft, a twin-engine Beaufighter, had been meticulously prepared by the ground crew, every instrument checked and double-checked. His co-pilot and radar operator, Flight Officer Walter Cleary, settled into the cramped compartment behind him, adjusting the clunky radar equipment that was supposed to give them an edge in the lightless sky. Cleary was a solid operator, calm under pressure, not given to flights of fancy. They had flown together for 8 months, and Giblin trusted him as much as he trusted anyone in this war. They took off into the winter darkness at 2200 hours, climbing steadily into a sky that seemed to swallow all light and warmth. Below them, the Rhine cut through the landscape like a silver ribbon when the clouds parted, reflecting whatever pale moonlight managed to penetrate the gloom. The air was bitter cold at altitude, and frost formed delicate patterns on the inside of the canopy. Giblin scanned the horizon with practiced eyes, watching for the telltale exhaust glow of enemy fighters, or the silhouette of a bomber against the stars. For the first hour, they saw nothing but emptiness, that vast and lonely darkness that night fighter pilots knew so well. It was Cleary who first noticed something odd on the radar screen. His voice crackled through the intercom, professional, but with an edge of confusion. The scope was showing something, he said, but the return signal made no sense. It appeared and disappeared, flickered at the edge of detection, behaved like nothing he had ever seen before. Giblin checked his instruments, confirmed their position, and scanned the sky once more. Nothing visible. Probably a malfunction, he told Cleary. The radar equipment was temperamental at best, prone to ghost signals and false readings. They would log it and have the technicians check it when they returned to base. Then Giblin saw it with his own eyes, and every rational explanation he had ever constructed began to crumble. Off his starboard wing, perhaps 200 yards distant, a sphere of light materialized out of the darkness. It glowed with a reddish-orange luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, like the beating of some vast heart. The object was roughly the size of a basketball, maybe larger, perfectly round and distinct against the black sky. No exhaust trail, no wings, no sound except the steady drone of his own engines. Just this impossible ball of fire, hovering in the night as if the laws of physics had suddenly become optional. Giblin's first instinct was to identify it as tracer fire or perhaps a flare, but the light didn't arc downward or fade away. It simply hung there, keeping perfect pace with his aircraft. His pulse quickened despite his efforts to remain calm. He had heard the stories, of course, whispered in the officers' mess and dismissed with nervous laughter. The other pilots called them Foo Fighters, a nonsense name for nonsense phenomena. Balls of light that followed Allied aircraft, matched their speed, seemed almost playful in their behavior. Giblin had always assumed these stories were the product of exhausted minds and too much time in the dark. Now, watching this thing glow against the night, he felt the first cold fingers of genuine fear touch the base of his spine. He keyed the intercom and asked Cleary if he could see it. The radar operator confirmed immediately, his voice tight with tension. The object was clearly visible from his position as well, still maintaining its distance off the starboard side. Whatever this was, it wasn't a hallucination or a trick of light. Both of them were seeing the same impossible thing. Giblin made his decision quickly. If this was some new German weapon, some kind of prototype tracking device or remote-controlled weapon, he needed to shake it off before it could do whatever it was designed to do. His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps it was radioing their position to night fighters waiting in ambush. Perhaps it would explode when it got close enough. Perhaps it was gathering intelligence on Allied aircraft capabilities. None of the explanations were comforting. He threw the Beaufighter into a steep banking turn, pulling the aircraft through maneuvers that pushed both machine and crew to their limits. The heavy fighter responded sluggishly, not built for aerobatics, but Giblin forced it through the turn anyway. The sphere of light matched him perfectly, maintaining its exact distance and position as if connected to his wing by an invisible rod. He tried climbing, pushing the throttles forward and angling upward into thinner air. The glowing orb climbed with him, effortless and silent. He dove, dropping altitude so rapidly that his instruments protested and Cleary grunted with the sudden pressure. The light followed, perfectly synchronized, as if his evasive maneuvers were no more challenging than gentle gliding. The frustration that built in Giblin's chest was unlike anything he had experienced in combat. Against enemy fighters, he had options, tactics, weapons. He could outmaneuver them, or outgun them, or outlast them. This thing offered no purchase for his skills, no weakness to exploit. It simply existed, glowing its eerie reddish orange, pacing his every move with contemptuous ease. He tried everything in his repertoire over the next several minutes. Barrel rolls that should have shaken off any pursuing aircraft, sudden changes in altitude and heading, speed variations that ranged from near stall to maximum thrust. Nothing made any difference. The sphere remained locked in position, a constant companion that refused to be left behind. Cleary's voice came through the intercom again, and now there was no disguising the fear beneath the professional tone. He reported that the radar was showing nothing where the object should be. The scope was clear, except for the normal ground returns and weather echoes. Whatever was out there, pacing them through the darkness, it was invisible to their electronic eyes. The thing that both men could see clearly with their own vision simply did not exist according to their instruments. The contradiction was deeply unsettling, suggesting that the rules they had relied upon to make sense of their world were suddenly and fundamentally wrong. Giblin radioed their position to ground control, requesting confirmation of any radar contacts in their vicinity. The response came back negative. The ground-based radar installations, far more powerful than the equipment in his aircraft, detected nothing unusual. According to everyone except the two men in the Beaufighter, the sky around them was completely empty. Giblin felt a surge of anger mixed with his fear. He knew what he was seeing. Cleary knew what he was seeing. The evidence of their eyes was incontrovertible. Yet the technology that was supposed to extend their senses and keep them safe reported only emptiness. For several more minutes, the bizarre formation continued. Giblin flew his assigned patrol pattern, and the sphere of light accompanied him like a faithful dog following its master. He found himself developing an irrational hatred for the thing, this intrusion of the inexplicable into his carefully ordered universe. Part of his mind insisted that there had to be an explanation, something he was missing. Some trick of atmospheric conditions or German ingenuity that would make sense of this encounter. But the larger part of his consciousness was forced to accept what his senses were telling him. He was being followed by something that defied explanation, something that seemed to mock his attempts to understand it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the object vanished. One moment it was there, glowing with that steady reddish-orange light, and the next moment the darkness was complete again. Giblin scanned the sky frantically, searching for any sign of where it had gone. Nothing. Cleary confirmed that it had simply blinked out of existence, leaving them alone in the night once more. The relief Giblin felt was complicated by a new anxiety. If the object could appear and disappear at will, how could he ever be certain it was truly gone? How could he trust the darkness around him? They completed their patrol in tense silence, both men watching the empty sky with new suspicion. When they finally touched down at base in the gray light of early morning, Giblin's hands were shaking slightly as he filled out his after-action report. He wrote down everything exactly as it had happened, knowing how it would sound, knowing that his reputation for reliability would be tested by these words. Cleary provided his own testimony, corroborating every detail. The encounter had lasted between 4 and 5 minutes, though it had felt much longer. The object had matched every evasive maneuver without apparent effort. Ground radar had detected nothing. Aircraft radar had detected nothing. Yet 2 experienced airmen had witnessed something that should not exist. The report made its way up the chain of command, passed from desk to desk by officers who didn't quite know what to do with it. Some suggested that Giblin and Cleary had seen ball lightning or St. Elmo's fire, natural phenomena that could sometimes appear near aircraft in certain atmospheric conditions. But Giblin had seen ball lightning before, and this was nothing like it. Others proposed that it was some kind of optical illusion created by ice crystals or reflected light. But no one could explain how an illusion could pace an aircraft through complex maneuvers or appear solid and distinct to 2 separate observers in different positions. Eventually, a stamp came down on the report, pressed into the paper with bureaucratic finality. The word it left behind was simple and unsatisfying. Unexplained. Not dismissed or debunked or explained away. Just acknowledged as something beyond the current ability of military intelligence to categorize or understand. The report was filed away with hundreds of others like it, testimonies from credible witnesses describing encounters with phenomena that refused to behave according to the known laws of physics or warfare. Giblin flew many more missions after that November night, and he survived the war to return home with his medals and his memories. But he never forgot the feeling of helplessness he had experienced in those minutes over the Rhine Valley, the frustration of being unable to shake something that toyed with him so effortlessly. He had gone up that night as a skeptic, certain that the strange stories told by other pilots were nothing more than misidentifications and mistakes. He came down a changed man, forced to accept that the world contained mysteries that his training and experience could not penetrate. The reddish-orange sphere had shattered his certainty, leaving in its place a troubling awareness that the darkness held more than just enemy aircraft and friendly stars. Sometimes, it held things that we have no names for, things that appear and vanish according to their own unknowable logic, leaving behind only the testimony of frightened men and reports stamped with that most honest of admissions, unexplained. The cold air at 20,000 feet cut through every seam and rivet of the B-17 flying fortresses as they droned toward Schweinfurt on the 14th of December, 1944. Inside the cramped fuselages, gunners huddled against the cold, their breath forming ice crystals that clung to their oxygen masks. The crews had made this run before, had seen the flak bloom like black flowers against winter skies, had watched sister ships spiral down, trailing smoke and flame. But nothing in their training, nothing in all the briefings and combat missions, could have prepared them for what appeared in the crystalline air that December afternoon. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a parade of American air power making its way deep into the heart of Germany. These were veteran crews, men who had learned to distinguish between contrails and fighters, between cloud formations and anti-aircraft bursts. They had flown through hell over Berlin, had navigated through flak so thick you could walk on it, as the saying went. They were not men given to flights of fancy or panic. They had been trained to observe, to identify, to report with precision. which makes what happened that day all the more remarkable and all the more unsettling. Lieutenant Frank Morrison was flying in the number 3 position of the lead squadron when his tail gunner's voice crackled through the intercom. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kozlowski had spotted something approaching from the rear, something that didn't match the profile of any known German aircraft. Morrison keyed his radio, ready to call out enemy fighters, but the words died in his throat when he saw them himself through the cockpit glass. They were spheres, perfectly round and gleaming like polished silver. 7 of them, flying in a formation so precise it looked geometric, mathematical. They moved with a grace that seemed to mock the heavy bombers laboring through the thin air. No wings, no propellers, no visible means of propulsion. Just smooth, reflective surfaces that caught the weak December sunlight and threw it back in dancing patterns. Morrison's co-pilot, Lieutenant James Hartley, later described the moment of first contact in the official debriefing. His voice, preserved in the typed transcripts, conveys the confusion of that instant. "They just appeared," he said. "One moment we're watching our position in the formation, the next moment they're there. Not approaching from a distance. Just there, like they'd materialized out of the air itself." Yen. Within seconds, the radio channels erupted with chatter. The strict radio discipline that had been drilled into every crew member dissolved as pilot after pilot reported the same phenomenon. The transcripts from that day make for extraordinary reading, a record of professional military aviators confronted with something that defied every category of their experience. Lead. "This is Baker 3. I have bogies at 2 o'clock level. Repeat, bogies at 2 o'clock. They're holding formation with us. Anyone else seeing this?" The voice belonged to Captain Robert Hayes, a pilot with 23 missions under his belt. Baker 3, lead confirms. "We see them. Can anyone identify?" The formation commander's voice carried an edge of tension that rarely appeared in combat communications. "Negative identification. Lee. They're like nothing I've ever seen. Spheres. Silver spheres. No markings, no exhaust, nothing. Roger that, Baker 3. All aircraft hold your fire. Repeat, hold your fire until we confirm hostile intent." No. The transcripts show that at least 6 aircraft reported the objects simultaneously, each crew providing descriptions that matched with eerie consistency. The spheres were approximately 3 to 4 feet in diameter. They maintained a position roughly 100 yards off the starboard side of the formation. They moved with the bombers, matching speed and altitude with mechanical precision, and they did nothing else. No aggressive maneuvers, no weapons fire, no attempts to interfere with the mission. They simply flew alongside the American bombers as if observing, witnessing, studying. Technical Sergeant Michael Donnelly was the top turret gunner on Morrison's aircraft. He had the clearest view of the objects, his position giving him an unobstructed line of sight. In the debriefing that followed, he described watching the spheres for nearly 15 minutes. "I had them dead in my sights," he testified. "Perfect shot, but they weren't doing anything, no hostility at all. It was like they were just keeping us company." The standing orders were clear. Anything unidentified in German airspace was to be considered hostile, but something stopped the gunners from opening fire. Perhaps it was the absolute strangeness of the objects, so unlike anything they had been trained to engage. Perhaps it was an instinct that conventional weapons would prove useless against whatever these things were. Or perhaps, as some later suggested, there was something about the spheres that communicated their benign intent, some quality that bypassed rational analysis and spoke directly to a deeper level of understanding. Staff Sergeant Joseph Ramirez, a waist gunner on another B-17, reported that he felt no fear when looking at the spheres. "That's what struck me as odd," he said during his interrogation by intelligence officers. "We were in enemy territory. Something unknown was flying right beside us, and I felt calm. Not scared, not threatened. Just curious. Like seeing something rare and beautiful that you know won't hurt you." This strange calm seemed to affect multiple crew members. The radio transcripts show that after the initial burst of excited chatter, a peculiar quiet settled over the formation. The pilots continued to monitor the objects, calling out position updates, but the tone shifted from alarm to something closer to wonder. These were men flying into one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany, men who knew that in less than an hour they would be fighting for their lives against flak and fighters. Yet for those 15 minutes the war seemed to pause, replaced by something inexplicable and profound. The spheres maintained their formation with inhuman perfection. No deviation, no wobble, no adjustment burn. They simply glided through the air as if gravity and wind resistance were suggestions rather than laws. Several crew members reported that the objects seemed to rotate slowly, their surfaces catching the light in ways that suggested depth and complexity beyond mere metal spheres. Lieutenant Morrison tried to take evasive action, a standard procedure when dealing with unknown aircraft. He banked his bomber 5 degrees to port, then back to starboard. The spheres matched every movement with instantaneous precision, maintaining their exact relative position. It was as if they were locked onto the formation by invisible rails, unable or unwilling to deviate from their assigned station. Lead, Baker, 3 die. I'm going to try something. Hayes's voice came through clearly on the recorded channel. Go ahead, Baker 3. Now, yar. I'm dropping speed by 10 knots. Let's see if they follow. A pause, filled with the background roar of engines and static. Then Hayes again, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. They matched it. Exact? They're still right there. The intelligence officers who later analyzed these transcripts noted the impossibility of what was being described. The B-17 cruised at approximately 180 miles per hour at that altitude. For the spheres to match speed changes instantaneously suggested either an anticipatory capability or a form of propulsion that operated outside known physics. Neither explanation brought comfort. As the formation approached the initial point, the beginning of the bombing run, the crew members braced themselves for the violence to come. The flak guns around Schweinfurt were legendary, and the Luftwaffe fighters usually made their heaviest attacks as the bombers steadied up for the target approach. It was the most dangerous phase of any mission, the minutes when evasive action became impossible and the aircraft flew straight and level, vulnerable to everything the Germans could throw at them. Bombardier, Lieutenant Thomas Chen, was hunched over his Norden bomb site when the spheres vanished. He happened to be looking directly at them, using them as a reference point while he made his calculations. They were there, he stated in his debriefing. Solid, real, reflecting sunlight. Then they weren't. No fade, no acceleration away, no movement into clouds. One instant present, the next instant gone. Like turning off a light switch. Then, one delay. Every crew that had observed the spheres reported the same phenomenon. The objects disappeared simultaneously, at precisely the moment the formation reached the initial point and began the bombing run. The timing was exact across all aircraft, despite the formation being spread over several miles of sky. Whatever the spheres were, they chose that specific instant to depart, as if their mission of observation had been completed. The bombing run proceeded as planned. The flak was murderous, tearing holes in wings and fuselages. 2 bombers went down over the target, spinning earthward with men trapped inside. The Luftwaffe fighters came in waves, their cannon fire raking the formation. It was the same nightmare the crews had experienced dozens of times before. The spheres were forgotten in the immediate struggle for survival. But when the battered formation finally turned for home, having dropped their bombs and fought their way out of the flak zone, the questions returned. What had they seen? What had flown beside them with such impossible grace and precision? The debriefing at the base in England lasted for hours. Intelligence officers interviewed each crew member separately, looking for inconsistencies, signs of mass hallucination, evidence of enemy secret weapons. They found none. The testimonies matched in every significant detail. The descriptions were consistent. The timing aligned across all aircraft. Either the crews were telling the truth about something genuinely anomalous, or they had all experienced the same elaborate delusion simultaneously. Major Robert Kingsley, the chief intelligence officer, struggled to frame his final report. The typed pages, still preserved in archives, show multiple revisions and crossed-out sections. How do you officially report that experienced combat crews witnessed objects that defied the laws of physics? How do you explain that these objects appeared to multiple aircraft simultaneously, maintained impossible formations, and vanished at a precise moment without any conventional means of propulsion or control? In the end, Kingsley's report was classified and filed away. The crews were told not to discuss the incident. Official explanations were offered, though none were particularly convincing. Ball lightning, despite occurring at 20,000 feet. Atmospheric phenomena, though none that matched the observed characteristics. German secret weapons, though no evidence of such technology ever emerged. The most disturbing aspect of the incident, the detail that kept Kingsley awake nights, was the timing of the disappearance. Why did the spheres vanish exactly when the bombing run began? If they were reconnaissance devices, wouldn't they stay to observe the attack? If they were weapons, why didn't they engage? The precision of their departure suggested intelligence, purpose, deliberation. Something had watched the American formation fly deep into Germany, had paced them for 15 minutes with mathematical exactitude, and had then withdrawn at the moment of maximum danger. As if the observation phase had concluded, and what came next was of no interest. The Schweinfurt incident was not unique. Similar reports came from other crews, other missions. But it remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases, with multiple witnesses, radio transcripts, and official debriefings all confirming the same impossible story. Decades later, when these files were finally declassified, researchers found themselves confronting the same questions that troubled Major Kingsley in 1944. In the cold air above Germany, experienced military observers saw something that should not exist, something that challenged every assumption about what was possible in the sky above a world at war. The autumn night sky over Germany in late 1944 was a predator's domain, and Captain Edward Schlueter owned that darkness. A highly decorated pilot of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, Schlueter had stalked enemy aircraft through countless moonless nights, his eyes trained to detect the faintest irregularity in the endless void above Europe. His aircraft, a radar-equipped night fighter, hummed beneath him with familiar vibrations as he sliced through the cold air at 10,000 feet. Below, the scarred landscape of wartime Germany lay hidden beneath cloud cover, while above, the stars provided just enough ambient light for a practiced eye to catch movement against their backdrop. Schlueter flew with the confidence born from dozens of successful missions, each one adding another layer to his reputation as one of the squadron's deadliest hunters. His radar operator sat behind him, eyes fixed on the green glow of the radar scope, calling out readings in the practiced rhythm they had developed over months of flying together. They were a matched set, a predator with two minds working in perfect synchrony. On this particular night, they were hunting for German aircraft, searching for the telltale blip that would indicate prey. The radar operator's voice cut through the engine noise with sudden urgency. Contact. Dot. Unknown aircraft. D. Distance approximately 2 miles, heading northeast at similar altitude. Schlueter felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied potential engagement. This was what he lived for, what he had trained for, what had earned him his decorations and the respect of his fellow pilots. He adjusted his heading, following the directions from his operator, eyes scanning the darkness ahead for any visual confirmation. The pursuit began as so many others had, a calculated chase through the night sky with Schlueter closing the distance based on radar guidance alone. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine respond with increased power. The gap narrowed. 1.5 miles. 1 mile. His hands rested lightly on the controls, ready to react the instant his prey attempted evasive maneuvers. But this target flew straight and level, seemingly unaware of the night fighter closing rapidly from behind. Then everything changed in an instant that would haunt Schlueter for the rest of his life. Off his right wing, the darkness suddenly erupted with light. 8 to 10 glowing red orbs materialized from nowhere, hanging in the night sky like burning coals suspended by invisible wire. Schlueter's first instinct was to check his instruments, to verify that his aircraft was functioning normally, that he wasn't experiencing some kind of system failure or oxygen deprivation. Everything read normal. He blinked hard, clearing his vision, but the objects remained, pulsing with an inner fire that cast a crimson glow across his wing. In his later debriefing, Schlueter would struggle to find adequate words to describe what he was seeing. The closest comparison he could offer was Christmas tree lights, those familiar red bulbs that glowed with warm incandescence. But these lights were anything but warm or comforting. They maintained a precise formation off his wing, matching his speed exactly, their glow steady and unwavering. There was no exhaust trail, no sound beyond his own engines, no conventional explanation for their presence at 10,000 feet over hostile territory. The decorated ace's training took over. An unknown contact was a potential threat, and threats were to be engaged and destroyed. Schlueter was not a man who hesitated or second-guessed himself in the air. He had survived this long by being aggressive, by taking the fight to the enemy before they could react. He banked sharply toward the glowing orbs, bringing his weapons to bear, fully intending to close the distance and open fire on whatever these objects might be. The orbs responded with impossible fluidity. They moved away from his approach with such precision that it seemed choreographed, maintaining their formation while avoiding his aggressive maneuver. Schlueter pursued, pushing his aircraft through a series of tactical approaches, each one designed to corner aerial prey and force them into a position where escape was impossible. But the glowing red spheres anticipated every move, or perhaps reacted with such speed that anticipation was unnecessary. They flowed through the night sky like oil on water, their movements so smooth and coordinated that they seemed to operate with a single shared consciousness. The captain attempted another attack run, this time approaching from a different angle, using techniques that had brought down enemy aircraft in the past. The orbs simply drifted away, maintaining their distance with maddening consistency. They were toying with him, Schlueter realized, or studying him. The thought sent the first tendril of unease creeping into his chest. In all his missions, in all his encounters with enemy fighters and bombers, he had always been the one in control. He was the hunter. He chose when to engage and when to break off. He dictated the terms of combat. Not this time. As Schlueter set up for another attack, the orbs changed their behavior. Instead of merely avoiding his approaches, they began to move toward him. The formation shifted, the glowing red spheres closing the distance to his aircraft with the same uncanny precision they had displayed while evading him. The hunter had become the hunted, and the role reversal hit Schlueter with visceral force. For the first time in his decorated career, genuine fear flooded through him. He broke hard left, pulling the aircraft into a violent turn that pushed him deep into his seat with gravitational force. The orbs followed. He reversed, throwing the fighter into a climbing right turn that would have left most aircraft wallowing and vulnerable. The orbs matched him perfectly, maintaining their formation and their pursuit. Schlueter's breathing came faster now, his hands gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity as he threw his aircraft through every evasive maneuver he knew. For over 20 miles, the nightmare pursuit continued. Schlueter dove and climbed, rolled and turned, pushed his aircraft to the edges of its performance envelope, in desperate attempts to shake the glowing objects from his tail. Behind him, his radar operator called out readings with mounting panic in his voice, confirming what Schlueter could see reflected in his canopy and dancing along his wings. The orbs stayed with them through every maneuver, through every desperate attempt to escape. They maintained their precise formation even as they followed the night fighter through aerobatics that should have scattered any conventional aircraft. The terror was absolute and all-consuming. Schlueter, who had faced anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters with steady nerves and tactical clarity, felt his chest constrict with primal fear. Whatever these objects were, they possessed capabilities far beyond anything he had encountered. They controlled the engagement completely, and he was powerless to either fight them or flee from them. The isolation of the night sky intensified his dread. There was no help coming, no wingman to call for assistance, no ground support that could reach him at 10,000 feet. He was alone with these impossible things, and they showed no sign of breaking off their pursuit. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the orbs departed. They simply accelerated away into the darkness with a speed that left Schlueter stunned. One moment they were pacing his aircraft, glowing with that steady red light, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the night as if they had never existed. Schlueter continued his evasive maneuvers for several more minutes, half convinced they were still out there, waiting to resume their pursuit. But his radar operator confirmed that the scopes were clear. They were alone in the sky once more. The flight back to base passed in a blur of adrenaline come down and racing thoughts. Schlueter ran through every possibility, every rational explanation he could construct for what had just occurred. Equipment malfunction, hallucination, some new German weapon or defensive technology. But none of the explanations satisfied. His instruments had functioned perfectly throughout the encounter. His radar operator had seen the same things he had, confirming the reality of the experience. And no known technology could perform the maneuvers those orbs had displayed. During debriefing, Schlueter sat across from intelligence officers and made an admission that went against every instinct he possessed as a decorated combat pilot. He told them with complete honesty that he had genuinely feared for his life. This was not an exaggeration for effect or a dramatic embellishment of a routine encounter. A man who had faced death countless times in aerial combat, who had earned his decorations through skill and courage under fire, confessed that he had been terrified by his encounter with the unknown objects. The maintenance crews found no mechanical problems with his aircraft. Despite the violent maneuvers, despite the stress Schlueter had placed on the airframe during his desperate evasive actions, the night fighter was in perfect working condition. There were no system failures to explain away the sighting, no equipment malfunctions that could account for the glowing orbs. The aircraft had performed exactly as designed throughout the entire encounter. Schlueter's account would become one of hundreds filed by Allied pilots during the final year of World War II, each describing similar encounters with unexplained glowing objects over European sky. But his testimony carried particular weight because of who he was. This was not a nervous rookie on his first mission, prone to mistaking Venus for an enemy fighter. This was one of the most highly decorated night fighter pilots in the squadron, a man whose judgment and observational skills had been proven in combat time and again. When Captain Edward Schlueter said he had been pursued by unknown objects that defied all known performance characteristics, people listened. The night sky over northern France hung heavy with clouds on the 15th of November, 1944. Flight Lieutenant David Marshall held the controls of his Bristol Beaufighter steady as he and his radar operator, Sergeant Thomas Wickham, cut through the darkness at 8,000 feet. They were on a routine night patrol, hunting for German aircraft that might be prowling the same corridors of sky. The war had ground on for years now, and both men had flown countless missions together, developing the kind of wordless communication that kept crews alive. The drone of the twin radial engines created a cocoon of sound around them, familiar and almost comforting in its mechanical predictability. Neither man could have known that in the next quarter hour, everything they understood about flying, about warfare, about the very nature of reality itself, would be called into question. The first indication that something was wrong came from Wickham. His voice crackled through the intercom with a note of confusion that Marshall had rarely heard from his usually unflappable operator. There was something on the scope, Wickham reported, but it didn't behave like anything he had tracked before. The contact appeared suddenly, without the gradual emergence typical of an approaching aircraft. It was simply there, as if it had materialized out of nothing. Marshall scanned the darkness ahead, seeing only the usual scatter of stars between cloud breaks. Then Wickham's voice came again, sharper this time, more urgent. The contact had multiplied. There were now 3 distinct returns on his screen, arranged in a perfect triangular formation. That was when Marshall saw them. At first they appeared as dim orange glows in the distance, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed almost organic, like the breathing of some vast creature. As he watched, they brightened, intensifying from a dull ember color to a brilliant burning orange that painted the clouds around them with hellish light. The objects moved closer with unsettling speed, covering what should have been several minutes of flight time in mere seconds. Marshall's hands tightened on the controls, his training telling him to take evasive action, but some deeper instinct held him steady. There was something about the way these lights moved that suggested they could match any maneuver he attempted. The 3 lights positioned themselves around the Beaufighter with mathematical precision. One held station off the port wing, another to starboard, and the third settled into position directly ahead. Marshall could see them clearly now. They were not simply lights, but appeared to be spherical objects that generated their own luminescence, the orange glow pulsing in waves across their surface. Each pulse seemed coordinated with the others, creating a synchronized rhythm that was hypnotic and deeply disturbing. There were no visible means of propulsion, no exhaust flames, no sound beyond the engines of his own aircraft. They simply hung there in the sky, defying everything he knew about aerodynamics and physics. Wickham's voice came through again, and now there was unmistakable fear threading through his professional composure. The objects were behaving impossibly on his radar screen. They would appear as solid contacts, then fade to nothing, then reappear in different positions without any indication of movement between those points. It was as if they were blinking in and out of existence, or perhaps existing in some state that his equipment could only intermittently detect. He had checked and rechecked his systems, but everything was functioning normally. The fault, if it could be called that, lay not with the technology but with the very nature of what they were observing. Marshall decided to test these visitors. He pushed the control column forward slightly, initiating a gentle descent. The 3 lights matched his movement instantly, maintaining their precise geometric arrangement around the aircraft. He pulled back, climbing 500 feet. Again the objects mirrored his action with such perfect timing that it seemed they had known what he would do before he did it. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the frigid air at altitude. These things, whatever they were, appeared to be anticipating his movements rather than merely reacting to them. He tried a banking turn to port, then one to starboard. Each time the lights adjusted their positions with fluid grace, reforming their triangular configuration around the Beaufighter, as if connected to it by invisible thread. The precision was absolute, inhuman. No pilot Marshall had ever flown with, or against, could maintain such exact positioning through aggressive maneuvers. And these objects were doing it effortlessly, as if the laws of inertia simply did not apply to them. Minutes stretched out, each one feeling longer than the last. 5 minutes became 10 Deutsch. The orange lights continued their pulsating dance, neither aggressive nor entirely passive. They simply maintained their stations, observing. That was the word that forced itself into Marshall's mind, despite his attempts to rationalize what was happening. These objects were observing them, studying them. The Beaufighter and its crew had become specimens under examination by an intelligence that operated according to rules utterly foreign to human understanding. Wickham reported new developments from his radar station. A 4th light had appeared, this one taking up position directly above the aircraft. Then a 5th materialized below. The triangular formation had become something more complex, more deliberate. The Beaufighter was now enclosed within a 3-dimensional geometric structure, a cage of pulsating orange light. Marshall felt his pulse quicken, fought to keep his breathing steady. The instinct to dive, to climb, to pour on full throttle and run, screamed at him from some primal part of his brain. But where would he run to? These things had demonstrated conclusively that they could match any maneuver he attempted. The lights shifted their pattern. The 5 spheres began to rotate around the aircraft in a slow, deliberate procession, like planets orbiting a sun. The precision of their movement was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Each light maintained its exact distance from the Beaufighter and from each other, never wavering, never hesitating. The rotation accelerated gradually, the orange glows beginning to leave trails of light across Marshall's vision. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped, snapping back into a new configuration. This time they formed a perfect pentagon around the aircraft, all 5 lights equidistant from the cockpit. Wickham's voice had taken on a hollow quality. 13 minutes now. 13 minutes of this impossible encounter, and his radar scope was telling him things that could not be true. The contacts were there, then not there, then appearing simultaneously in multiple locations, before resolving back into single point. He had trained for years to interpret radar returns, to distinguish friend from foe, to track the movements of enemy aircraft through the darkness. Nothing in that training had prepared him for objects that seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, present and absent at the same time. Marshall made a decision. He reached for the radio, tuning to the frequency for their home base. His hand trembled slightly as he keyed the microphone, and he had to clear his throat twice before his voice would work properly. He reported their position, reported the encounter, described as clearly as he could the objects that had surrounded his aircraft for over a quarter of an hour. The response came back quickly, but it brought no comfort, no guidance, no reassurance. Command had listened to his report. There was a long pause, filled with the crackle of static and the weight of confusion traveling across the radio waves. Then the controller's voice returned, and Marshall could hear the uncertainty in it, the complete absence of protocol or procedure. They had no instructions for him. No standing orders covered this situation. No manual had been written, no training provided. The controller's words were simple, and somehow more frightening than the lights themselves. Return to base. Just return to base. That was all. No advice on how to evade these objects. No explanation for what they might be. No promise of fighter support or emergency procedures. Just an acknowledgement that something beyond their understanding was happening, and a simple instruction to come home if he could. As if responding to the radio transmission itself, the 5 lights began to withdraw. They moved away from the Beaufighter in perfect synchronization, maintaining their pentagonal formation as they retreated. The orange glow dimmed gradually, pulsing more slowly now, like a heartbeat returning to rest. Marshall and Wickham watched in silence as the objects receded into the distance, becoming dim embers once more, then pinpoints, then nothing. The darkness of the November night closed back around them, and they were alone again, with only the familiar drone of their engines. Wickham's radar scope showed empty sky. Whatever the objects had been, they were gone now, vanished as suddenly and completely as they had appeared. Marshall turned the Beaufighter toward home, his hands still gripping the controls with unnecessary force, his mind trying to process what had just occurred. 15 minutes. 15 minutes of contact with something that demonstrated technology far beyond anything in the known arsenal of any nation, something that had treated their aircraft like a curious specimen to be examined and catalogued. Neither man spoke much on the flight back. What was there to say? The encounter had fundamentally altered their understanding of what was possible, of what might be sharing the skies with them. When they finally landed and climbed out of the cockpit, they found that their report had already preceded them. Others had questions, so many questions, but no answers. The objects had not been hostile, but that brought little comfort. Something had found them in the darkness over France, something with capabilities that mocked human engineering, and it had studied them with the detached interest of a scientist examining insects under glass. And then, its curiosity apparently satisfied, it had simply departed, leaving only questions and the profound unsettling knowledge that we are not alone in our skies, and we may never have been. Lieutenant David McFalls had been the kind of pilot everyone wanted on their wing. By March of 1945, his service record read like a textbook example of military excellence: 43 successful combat missions, 2 commendations for valor, and a reputation among his squadron mates as the steadiest hand in the entire 15th Air Force. His commanding officers noted in his file that McFalls possessed an almost supernatural calm under fire, the kind of temperament that could talk a panicked crew through flak-filled skies without his voice ever rising above a conversational tone. Men who flew with him said he had ice water in his veins, that nothing could rattle David McFalls. That assessment would prove tragically, devastatingly wrong. The mission briefing on March 21st seemed routine, almost mundane given how close the war was to its conclusion. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy resistance over the target area, an industrial complex nestled in the Austrian Alps near the town of Zell am See. The weather promised to be clear, visibility unlimited, and the squadron's morale was riding high on the knowledge that home was just weeks away. McFalls joked with his co-pilot during pre-flight checks, talking about the restaurant he planned to open in Cleveland once the war ended, how he'd serve the best steaks in Ohio. His wingman, Second Lieutenant James Holloway, would later recall that McFalls seemed more relaxed than he'd seen him in months, genuinely looking forward to what both men assumed would be just another milk run in the closing days of a nearly finished war. They departed their base in southern Italy at 0700 hours, 14 B-24 Liberators climbing into the brilliant morning sky. The flight across the Adriatic was uneventful, the kind of peaceful transit that made the war feel almost abstract. McFalls maintained perfect formation, his aircraft positioned exactly where it should be, engines humming in synchronized harmony. As they crossed into Austrian airspace and the Alps rose before them like jagged white teeth against the azure sky, Holloway radioed over to comment on the breathtaking view. McFalls responded that it was almost enough to make him forget they were at war. Those would be the last normal words anyone would hear from David McFalls for quite some time. The objects appeared at approximately 09:15 hours, manifesting so suddenly that several pilots initially thought they were seeing reflections or optical illusions caused by the intense sunlight reflecting off snow-covered peaks. But these lights moved with purpose and intelligence, not following any pattern of natural phenomena. Holloway counted 7 distinct orbs, each roughly spherical and glowing, with a pale orange luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. They were significantly larger than any aircraft anyone in the formation had ever seen, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, though judging distances against the mountain backdrop proved nearly impossible. What happened next violated every assumption about aerial physics that these experienced combat pilots had accumulated. The orbs didn't approach McFalls' aircraft in any conventional sense. Instead, they appeared to materialize at strategic points around his plane, positioning themselves with geometric precision, 1 directly ahead, 2 on each flank, and 2 trailing behind at slightly higher altitude. McFalls' voice crackled over the radio, still controlled but carrying an edge of confusion. He reported the objects, asking if anyone else could confirm visual contact. Holloway and 3 other pilots immediately acknowledged they could see them, describing the same orange glow, the same impossible positioning around McFalls' Liberator. Then the objects began to move, and what had been strange became terrifying. They started to herd McFalls away from the formation, maintaining their geometric arrangement while slowly, inexorably guiding his aircraft eastward, away from the squadron's heading. McFalls attempted to correct course, banking hard to port. But as he did, the orbs shifted with him, maintaining their positions relative to his aircraft with a precision that suggested not just intelligence, but intimate knowledge of his intention. It was as if they could anticipate his every move before he made it, adjusting their formation microseconds ahead of his control inputs. Holloway broke formation to follow, trying to close the distance, but the orbs seemed unconcerned with his presence, focusing their attention entirely on McFalls. The radio traffic became increasingly frantic. McFalls reported that his instruments were going haywire, compass spinning uselessly, altimeter readings fluctuating by thousands of feet from second to second, airspeed indicator frozen at 0, despite the fact he could feel the aircraft responding normally to his controls. His voice, that famously unshakable voice, began to climb in pitch and urgency. He described a sensation of being pulled, not physically but through some force he couldn't articulate, as if the very air around his aircraft had become a current carrying him in a direction chosen by the object. At 0922 hours, the orbs began to pulse, not randomly, but in perfect synchronization, creating a strobe effect that Holloway described in his debriefing as hypnotic and deeply disturbing. The pulses started slowly, perhaps 1 every 2 seconds, bathing McFalls' aircraft in alternating waves of brilliant orange light and shadow. Then the frequency increased, faster and faster until the pulsing became almost continuous, a seizure-inducing flash that made it nearly impossible to look directly at McFalls' plane. Several pilots in the formation reported feeling disoriented just from watching the display, experiencing vertigo and nausea despite being hundreds of yards away from the phenomena. McFalls' radio calls deteriorated from professional reporting to something approaching panic. He screamed that the lights were inside his head, that he could feel them somehow probing, examining, taking him apart, and putting him back together. His co-pilot and bombardier both tried to take control of the aircraft, but McFalls wouldn't relinquish the yoke, convinced that if he let go, the orbs would immediately destroy them all. He shouted coordinates that made no sense, referenced landmarks that didn't exist, begged someone to explain what was happening to him. Holloway pushed his engines to maximum power, trying desperately to reach his friend, but the distance between them kept expanding as if the orbs were warping the very space around McFalls' Liberator. Then came the moment that would haunt James Holloway for the remaining 63 years of his life. The orbs suddenly contracted inward, collapsing from their geometric formation into a tight cluster around McFalls' aircraft. For perhaps 3 seconds, they merged into a single sphere of light so brilliant that pilots had to look away or risk permanent eye damage. The light intensified beyond anything describable, beyond the sun itself, transforming McFalls' bomber into nothing more than a dark silhouette at the center of an impossible star. Holloway later told investigators he was certain in that moment he was watching his friend die, that the objects were incinerating the aircraft and everyone aboard. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the orbs vanished, not gradually fading or accelerating away, but instantaneously ceasing to exist, as if someone had flipped a switch that controlled their presence in reality. McFalls' aircraft remained, still flying, still intact, but wobbling uncertainly as it emerged from whatever experience had just occurred. The radio carried only silence and the sound of someone breathing in ragged, shuddering gasps. Holloway called out repeatedly, trying to raise McFalls, but received no response for nearly a full minute. When McFalls finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, completely unlike the man Holloway had known. He simply stated that he was returning to base and would not be discussing what had occurred. The flight back to Italy took on the character of a funeral procession. McFalls maintained radio silence despite repeated attempts at communication from both Holloway and the squadron commander WWII. He flew mechanically, precisely, but without any of his characteristic grace or confidence. Several pilots reported that watching his aircraft was like watching a ghost ship. Technically perfect, but somehow fundamentally wrong, piloted by someone or something that understood the mechanics of flight, but had forgotten what it meant to truly fly. Upon landing, McFalls taxied to his hardstand and shut down his engines with textbook procedure. But when the ground crew opened the aircraft, they found the entire flight crew sitting in stunned silence, staring at nothing. McFalls had to be physically helped from the cockpit, his hands locked in a death grip on the control yoke even with the engines cold and still. Medical personnel immediately transported him to the base hospital, where doctors found him physically unharmed but psychologically unreachable, locked in some internal space where their questions couldn't penetrate. The psychiatric evaluation conducted over the following 3 days revealed a man fundamentally altered by his experience. Dr. Harold Weinstein, a skilled psychiatrist who had treated countless cases of combat fatigue, wrote in his report that McFalls presented unlike any trauma case he had previously encountered. The lieutenant could describe the events in extraordinary detail, could recount every moment of the encounter with perfect clarity, but he did so without emotion, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else entirely. More disturbing was McFalls' absolute insistence that the objects were not of this earth, that they represented something beyond human comprehension or classification. In one particularly chilling excerpt from his evaluation, McFalls told Dr. Weinstein that the Orbs had been observing him, studying him the way a scientist might study an insect under glass. He described feeling his thoughts being read, his memories being accessed and cataloged by an intelligence so vastly superior to human consciousness that attempting to comprehend it had nearly shattered his sanity. He stated with complete conviction that the Orbs had let him go not out of mercy, but because they had finished collecting whatever information they wanted. The implication, left hanging in his testimony, was that the encounter had been conducted according to purposes and motivations entirely beyond human understanding. Dr. Weinstein's recommendation was immediate and unequivocal. Lieutenant David McFalls was to be permanently grounded, unfit for combat duty or any flying operations. The psychological trauma, whatever its source, had rendered him incapable of the split-second decision-making required of a combat pilot. The review board agreed without debate. McFalls was transferred to a desk assignment in England, where he spent the final weeks of the war processing paperwork and watching other men fly missions he would never join again. But the strangest evidence emerged when maintenance crews examined McFalls' aircraft in detail. Every instrument containing ferrous metal had been permanently magnetized. Compasses spun uselessly, unable to find magnetic north. Gauge needles adhered to their housings. Even tools brought near the aircraft became magnetized themselves, picking up metal shavings and tacks, as if they'd been deliberately converted into permanent magnets. Engineers and scientists examined the phenomenon, testing and retesting, unable to explain how such comprehensive magnetization could occur without a sustained exposure to magnetic fields thousands of times more powerful than anything known to exist in nature or available through human technology. The official report classified the incident as unexplained aerial phenomena, filed it away, and forbade anyone involved from discussing the detail. David McFalls returned to Cleveland after the war, opened his restaurant as planned, and never spoke publicly about his experience over the Austrian Alps. He refused all interviews, declined to participate in any investigations or studies, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life until his death in 1992. But those who knew him said he was never quite the same, that something essential had been taken from him during those 7 minutes above the snow-covered mountains, something he could never recover or replace. The glowing orbs that danced through the night skies over Europe and the Pacific during World War II vanished, almost as mysteriously as they had appeared. Within months of the war's end in 1945, the Foo Fighter reports that had filled military intelligence files across multiple continents simply stopped. This abrupt cessation remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire phenomenon. After years of consistent sightings by thousands of trained observers, the lights disappeared, as if whatever had been watching the greatest conflict in human history had simply lost interest and moved on. 8 decades later, we are left with thick files of declassified documents, stacks of pilot testimonies, and no satisfying answers. The Foo Fighters remain stubbornly unexplained, defying every attempt to categorize them into comfortable, rational explanations. Theories have been proposed, investigated, and ultimately found wanting. Each hypothesis manages to account for some aspects of the sightings, but none can explain the full scope of what was witnessed. Ball lightning stands as perhaps the most scientifically respectable explanation. This rare atmospheric phenomenon produces glowing spheres of ionized gas that can float through the air, sometimes following aircraft or ground vehicle. The problem is that ball lightning typically lasts only seconds, perhaps a minute at most. The Foo Fighters were observed for extended periods, sometimes following aircraft for hundreds of miles across entire missions. Ball lightning cannot execute controlled maneuvers, yet pilots consistently reported these objects pacing their aircraft, matching speed changes, and performing coordinated movements. Ball lightning does not appear in formation, yet Foo Fighters were often seen in groups, maintaining precise distances from one another. St. Elmo's fire has also been suggested as an explanation. This electrical discharge phenomenon creates glowing plasma around aircraft during certain atmospheric conditions, particularly in thunderstorms or areas of strong electrical activity. Any experienced pilot, however, knows what St. Elmo's fire looks like. It appears as a static glow on the aircraft itself, clinging to wings, propellers, and sharp edges. It does not separate from the aircraft. It does not fly in formation alongside the plane. It does not pace bombers from Germany back to England and then turn away precisely at the coastline, as Foo Fighters were documented doing. The pilots who reported Foo Fighters were intimately familiar with St. Elmo's fire. They knew the difference. The secret Nazi technology theory captured public imagination for years after the war. Perhaps, some suggested, these were advanced German weapons systems, test platforms for technologies far ahead of their time. The German military certainly pursued unconventional weapons research during the war years, and some of their developments were indeed surprising. But this theory collapses under the weight of one simple fact. German and Japanese pilots reported identical phenomena. Luftwaffe crews saw the same glowing objects over Germany that Allied bomber crews witnessed. Japanese pilots in the Pacific Theater filed reports describing lights that matched those seen by American fighter pilots. If these were German secret weapons, why were they harassing German aircraft? And why would the Japanese, Germany's ally, have developed identical technology independently? Furthermore, extensive interrogation of German scientists and engineers after the war, combined with the capture of Nazi research facilities and documents, revealed no evidence of any project matching the Foo Fighter descriptions. The Allies were intensely interested in German technological advances. They would have discovered such a program. They found rocket technology, jet engines, and various experimental weapons, but nothing that explained the glowing orbs that had puzzled their pilots throughout the war. Some researchers have proposed psychological explanations, suggesting mass hallucination or war-induced stress causing pilots to misidentify ordinary phenomena. This theory fundamentally misunderstands who these witnesses were. These were not untrained civilians prone to panic or fantasy. They were military aviators, selected and rigorously trained specifically for their ability to remain calm under pressure and accurately identify objects in three-dimensional space at high speeds. Their lives depended on correctly distinguishing friendly aircraft from enemy fighters in split-second encounters. Many had college educations. They were trained observers whose reports of enemy aircraft, damage assessments, and mission outcomes were trusted to guide strategic military decisions. More importantly, their testimonies were remarkably consistent across different theaters of war, different air forces, and different nationalities. American pilots in Europe described the same phenomena as British crews over the same territory. Reports from the Pacific matched those from the European theater. German pilots who had never communicated with Allied aircrews reported identical characteristics. This consistency across isolated groups makes mass hallucination or systematic misidentification virtually impossible. The declassified documents reveal just how seriously military intelligence took these reports. Both Allied and Axis powers launched formal investigations. Files from British intelligence showed detailed analyses of Foo Fighter reports, attempts to correlate sightings with enemy activity, and searches for possible explanations. American military intelligence conducted similar investigations, collecting pilot testimonies and searching for patterns. The Germans, concerned these might be Allied secret weapons, also investigated thoroughly. What emerges from these documents is striking. Neither side ever claimed to have created the Foo Fighters. Neither side ever provided an explanation for what their pilots were witnessing. The investigation simply documented the phenomenon, noted its consistency, and essentially filed it away as unexplained. The objects did not appear to be hostile. They never attacked, never interfered with missions beyond their unsettling presence. In the midst of total war, military commanders had more pressing concerns than mysterious lights that only watched. But watch they did. Across hundreds of documented encounters, the Foo Fighters exhibited behavior that suggested observation more than anything else. They appeared near combat aircraft. They maintained distance while pacing bombers and fighters. They seemed most active in areas of intense conflict. And then when the war ended and the skies fell silent of combat, they vanished. This correlation between the phenomenon and the conflict itself remains unexplained. If these were natural atmospheric phenomena, why would they cease with the end of the war? Ball lightning and St. Elmo's fire did not stop occurring in 1945. If they were misidentifications of ordinary objects, human perception did not fundamentally change when peace was declared. The connection between the sightings and the war suggests something more puzzling, something that implies intention or purpose. We are left with mysteries layered upon mysteries. Objects witnessed by thousands of trained observers across multiple continents, documented in official military reports, investigated by intelligence services, and yet never explained. Phenomena that appeared with the greatest conflict in human history and vanished when it ended, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. The question that haunts researchers today is not merely what the Foo Fighters were, but whether they are truly gone. Did they simply cease to exist, or did they withdraw, their observation complete? The Second World War represented humanity at its most destructive, mobilizing entire nations for industrial-scale killing, unleashing atomic weapons that split the very atoms of matter. If something was drawn to observe that conflict, to witness what humans do to each other when civilization breaks down, is it still out there? Is it watching still, waiting in whatever realm it inhabits, patient and eternal? And if the Foo Fighters returned when humanity tore itself apart, will they return again? Are they waiting for the next great conflict, the next time we fill the skies with machines of war? The files remain open, the question unanswered. Somewhere in the darkness above us, are they watching as they watched before? Silent witnesses to our capacity for both wonder and horror? That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.